The Assyrian Empire c. 961 to BCE. The Assyrian Empire, which saw its height of power at the end of the first millennium to the 7th century BCE, was larger than any empire that preceded it. Dominating the region, its well-equipped soldiers used their stronger iron weapons to extend the empire's control through Mesopotamia, Syria, parts of Anatolia, Palestine, and up the Nile. Into Egypt, they used siege warfare, along with battering rams, tunnels, and movable towers. To get past the defenses of cities, the Assyrians had a large army with perhaps as many as 150,000 soldiers that utilized a corps of infantry, a cavalry, as well as chariots, as part of their military strategy. The Assyrians purposefully tried to inspire fear in their enemies. They decapitated conquered kings, burned cities to the ground, destroyed crops, and dismembered defeated enemy soldiers. One Assyrian soldier claimed, "In strife and conflict I besieged and conquered the city. I felled 3,000 of their fighting men with the sword. I captured many troops alive. I cut off of some of their arms and hands. I cut off of others their noses, ears, and extremities. I gouged out the eyes of many troops. I made one pile of the living and one of heads. I hung their heads on trees around the city." 5. The Assyrians expected these methods to deter potential rebellions and used their spoils of war, like precious metals and livestock, to finance further military campaigns. After conquering an area, they conscripted men into their army, and employed resettlement and deportation as techniques to get laborers where they wanted them and deal with communities who opposed their regime. They also collected annual tributes that were apparently high enough to, at least occasionally, spur rebellions, despite the Assyrians' reputation for violent retribution. In addition to its military strength, the Assyrian Empire also stands out for the size of its cities and its administrative developments. The empire's biggest cities, such as Nineveh and Ashur, each had several million people living within them. Administratively, kings ruled Assyria, appointing governors to oversee provinces and delegates to keep tabs on the leaders of allied states. There were between 100 and 150 governors, delegates, and top officials entrusted by the king with ruling in his place and helping him maintain the empire. In the later centuries of the Assyrian Empire, kings chose these officials on the basis of merit and loyalty. Kings met with large groups of officials for rituals, festivals, and military campaigns. Evidence of such meetings has led some scholars to propose the possibility that the king and his officials might have worked together in something resembling a parliamentary system, though there is no scholarly consensus on the point. Ultimately, the Assyrian Empire became too large to control. Rebellions occurred with more frequency and were difficult for its overextended military to quell. The empire fell after the conquest of Nineveh in 612 BCE. After the Akkadian Empire fell apart, there was Assyria in the north and Babylonia in the south. You can also see the Hittite Empire, the Mitanni, and the territory held by the Egyptians at the time. Alone of the major states of the Bronze Age, the Assyrian kingdom in northern Mesopotamia survived, probably because of their extreme focus on militarism. The Assyrians were able to hold on to their core cities while the states around them collapsed. During the Iron Age, the Assyrians became the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. The Assyrians were the first empire in world history to systematically conquer almost all of their neighbors using a powerful standing army and go on to control the conquered territory for hundreds of years. The Assyrians were shaped by their environment. Their region in northern Mesopotamia, Ashur, has no natural borders, and thus they needed a strong military to survive. They were constantly forced to fight other civilized peoples from the west and south, and barbarians from the north. The Assyrians held that their patron god, a god of war also called Ashur, demanded the subservience of other peoples and their respective gods. Thus, their conquests were justified by their religious beliefs as well as a straightforward desire for dominance. Eventually, they dispatched annual military expeditions and organized conscription, fielding large standing armies of native Assyrian soldiers who marched out every year to conquer more territory. The period of political breakdown in Mesopotamia following the collapse of the Bronze Age ended in about 880 BCE, when the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II began a series of wars to conquer Mesopotamia and Canaan. Over the next century, the Assyrians became the mightiest empire yet seen in the Middle East. They used siege warfare, along with battering rams, tunnels, and movable towers, to get past the defenses of cities. As part of their military strategy, the Assyrians purposefully tried to inspire fear in their enemies. They decapitated conquered kings, burned cities to the ground, destroyed crops, and dismembered defeated enemy soldiers. They fought from the north, which along with swords and short lances wielded from horseback made chariots permanently obsolete. The major focus of Assyrian taxation and bureaucracy was to keep the army funded and trained, which allowed them to completely dominate their neighbors for well over a century. By the time of the reign of Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III 457–7 BCE, the Assyrians had pushed their borders to the Mediterranean in the west and to Persia present-day Iran in the east. Their conquests culminated in 671 BC, when King Esarhaddon 681–668 BC invaded Egypt and conquered not only the entire Egyptian kingdom, but northern Nubia as well. This is the first time in history that both of the founding river valleys of ancient civilization, those of the Nile and of Mesopotamia, were under the control of a single political entity. The region executions were not uncommon, nor were whippings, followed by forced labor. While their subjects experienced Assyrian rule as militarily enforced tyranny, Assyrian kings were proud of the cultural and intellectual heritage of Mesopotamia and supported learning and scholarship. The one conquered city in their empire that was allowed a significant degree of autonomy was Babylon, out of respect for its role as a center of Mesopotamian culture. Assyrian scribes collected and copied the learning and literature of the entire Middle East. Sometime after 660 BCE, the king Ashurbanipal ordered the collection of all of the texts of all of his kingdom, including the ones from conquered lands, and he went on to create a massive library to house them. Parts of this library survived and provide one of the most important sources of information that scholars have on the beliefs, languages, and literature of the ancient Middle East. The monument of Ashurnasirpal II, who was king of Assyria from 883 to 859 BC, describes his conquest of one city-states. Of some, I cut off their feet and hands, of others I cut off their ears, noses and lips. Of the young men's ears I made a heap, of the old men's heads I made a minaret. The male children and female children I burned in the flames of the city. Ultimately, the Assyrian Empire became too large to control. Rebellions occurred with more frequency and were difficult for its overextended military to quell. The Assyrians finally fell in 609 BCE, overthrown by a series of rebellions. Their control of Egypt lasted barely 2 generations, brought to an end when the puppet pharaoh put in place by the Assyrians rebelled and drove them from Egypt. Shortly thereafter, a Babylonian king, Nabopolassar, led a rebellion that finally succeeded in sacking Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. The Babylonians were allied with clans of horse-riding warriors in Persia called the Medes, and between them the Assyrian state was destroyed completely. Nabopolassar went on to found the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which became the most important power in Mesopotamia for the next few generations.